The photograph is famous. You've probably seen it. Allied commanders standing together in 1945. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, smiling, victorious, united. That photograph is a lie. Not because it was staged, but because it hides the truth about what really held the Allied coalition together during World War II. It wasn't shared values. It wasn't natural friendship between democracies. It wasn't even a common vision of what victory should look like. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany was held together by something far more fragile: mutual need and carefully managed crisis after carefully managed crisis. One senior British diplomat wrote in his private diary, "We won because we needed each other more than we hated working together." That sentence, never meant for publication, reveals more truth about Allied unity than 1,000 official histories. This is the story they didn't teach you, the untold truth about how the most successful military alliance in history actually functioned, and how close it came to falling apart. When most people think about World War II, they imagine natural allies fighting together against obvious evil. The reality was far more complicated. Britain entered the war in 1939 as a fading empire, desperate to preserve its global influence. The Soviet Union joined in 1941 as a communist dictatorship with territorial ambitions that terrified the West. America entered in 1941 as a rising superpower, skeptical of European colonial powers and deeply distrustful of Soviet communism. These weren't natural partners. They were rivals, forced into an alliance by a common threat. And that difference shaped everything. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, privately told President Roosevelt that coordinating with the British was like trying to dance with a partner who keeps changing the music. Winston Churchill complained to his staff that American generals were naive children playing at war, while the real professionals clean up their mistakes. Joseph Stalin believed both Western allies were deliberately stalling their invasion of France to let Germany and the Soviet Union bleed each other dry. None of them were entirely wrong. The official histories talk about Allied unity as if it was a given, as if democratic values and anti-fascism naturally produced cooperation. The truth is that Allied unity was an achievement, not an assumption. It had to be built, maintained, and constantly rebuilt, often over the objections of the very generals and politicians who would later take credit for it. And that achievement began with a lie that everyone agreed to tell. In December 1941, immediately after Pearl Harbor, American and British leaders met in Washington to plan their strategy. They emerged with a clear statement: Germany first. The Allies would concentrate their resources on defeating Nazi Germany before fully committing to the Pacific War against Japan. On paper, this showed perfect unity, Americans and British agreeing on strategic priorities, despite the fact that America had just been attacked by Japan, not Germany. But behind closed doors, almost no one believed it would hold. American military planners were furious. Japan had attacked American territory. American public opinion demanded revenge against Japan, not Germany. Yet Roosevelt and Marshall insisted on the Germany first strategy. Why? Because they knew that if America concentrated on the Pacific, Britain might lose the war in Europe before American forces could make a difference. And if Britain fell, Nazi Germany would control Europe's industrial capacity and resources. One American admiral walked out of the planning meeting and told his aide, "We just agreed to let Japan run wild while we save the British Empire. The American people will never forgive us if they find out." The British knew this too, which is why they pushed so aggressively for Germany first, not because they cared about American strategic interests, but because they needed American men and material in Europe. This wasn't unity, this was a transaction. America would fight Germany first to save Britain. In exchange, Britain would support American dominance in post-war international institutions. Neither side was honest about the bargain. Both sides claimed it was about shared values and natural alliance. But this fragile agreement would face its first major test within months. In 1942, Stalin demanded that America and Britain open a second front in Europe immediately. Soviet forces were absorbing the vast majority of German combat power. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were dying while the Western Allies hesitated to invade occupied France. Stalin's demand put intense pressure on the fragile Anglo-American relationship. American generals, led by George Marshall, wanted to invade France in 1943. Strike fast, strike hard, win the war quickly. The British said no, absolutely not. In a tense meeting at 10 Downing Street, British Chief of the Imperial General Staff Alan Brooke stood before a map of France and asked the Americans a simple question: where will you bury the bodies? The room went silent. British military culture, shaped by the catastrophic losses of World War I, insisted on careful preparation, overwhelming force, and near-certain success before attempting an invasion. To British planners, American eagerness for immediate action looked like suicidal naivety. To American commanders watching the Soviet Union bleed, British caution looked like cowardice disguised as prudence. The debate became so heated that Churchill and Roosevelt had to intervene directly. The compromise was Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942. It wasn't what the Americans wanted, it wasn't what Stalin demanded, but it was something the British and Americans could agree to do together. Stalin was furious. He accused the Western Allies of deliberately leaving the Soviet Union to bear the brunt of German aggression. He wasn't entirely wrong. But what Stalin didn't understand, what the official histories rarely acknowledge, is that the Second Front delay wasn't about ideology or betrayal. It was about the simple fact that Britain and America couldn't agree on when or where to invade. This failure to agree would directly shape how D-Day was finally planned. By 1944, the alliance had learned some hard lessons. The biggest: you cannot fight a coalition war without clear command authority. Dwight Eisenhower was named Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, not as a figurehead, but as the actual commander of all Allied forces in Western Europe. This seems obvious now, but in 1944 it was revolutionary. For centuries, Allied alliances had been coalitions where each nation's forces remained under national command. Allied operations required negotiation, coordination, and constant political oversight. D-Day was different. British, American, and Canadian forces would operate under a unified command structure with Eisenhower at the top. British commanders would answer to Eisenhower, not just to Churchill. American generals would answer to Eisenhower, not just to Washington. This created something that hadn't existed before, a truly integrated military command where national forces subordinated themselves to collective objectives. It worked. D-Day succeeded. The liberation of Europe began. But unity through structure had a cost. British politicians worried about losing influence over military operations. American generals grew frustrated when British planning traditions slowed decision-making. Each nation's military culture, American emphasis on speed and aggression versus British focus on methodical preparation, created constant friction. And when Allied forces broke out of Normandy in August 1944, that friction nearly tore the alliance apart.
After the breakout from Normandy, Allied forces raced across France faster than anyone had anticipated. Paris was liberated. The German army seemed on the verge of collapse. And immediately, the fundamental disagreement about how to end the war erupted. British command culture favored concentrating Allied forces for a single powerful thrust into Germany's industrial heartland. American strategic tradition emphasized a broad front approach with multiple armies advancing simultaneously. Behind these competing visions lay deeper questions. Who would lead the final advance? Who would take Berlin? Who would shape the post-war settlement? In September 1944, British commanders proposed Operation Market Garden, an ambitious plan to seize bridges in Holland and drive into Germany. Many historians believe the operation was designed partly to prove that concentrated thrust strategies could win the war faster than American broad front methods. Market Garden failed catastrophically. British and Polish paratroopers at Arnhem fought alone for 9 days. Of 10,000 men, only 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. One British paratrooper, writing home after his capture, said simply, "We were told the ground forces would reach us in 2 days. They never came." This wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a crisis of trust. American commanders believed the operation had been inadequately supported. British commanders believed American commitment to the plan had been half-hearted at best. The recriminations were bitter and immediate. In December 1944, Germany launched its surprise offensive through the Ardennes. American forces were caught completely unprepared. Units were surrounded. The front collapsed. And in the chaos, the accumulated tensions of 3 years nearly destroyed the alliance. British commanders suggested that coordination of the counterattack required placing American forces under British operational control in certain sectors. American generals saw it differently. They saw an attempt to exploit American failure to restore British command authority. General Omar Bradley told Eisenhower privately, "I cannot be responsible to my country if you do this. I will have no choice but to resign." The alliance was fracturing in the middle of the largest German offensive since 1940. Eisenhower made the decision that would define his legacy. He temporarily adjusted command boundaries, not to prove British superiority, but because tactical communication lines required it. Then he turned to Patton and asked how quickly American forces could attack into the German flank. Within 3 weeks, the Bulge was eliminated. German forces were shattered. The final advance into Germany resumed. But something had changed. The pretense of natural unity was gone. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin in early 1945, the facade of unity finally cracked beyond repair. Churchill wanted Western forces to race to Berlin and occupy as much of Eastern Europe as possible before Soviet armies arrived. Eisenhower disagreed. He argued that Berlin was militarily irrelevant. Soviet forces were closer and would take it regardless. Behind this strategic debate was the real question: what would the post-war world look like? Churchill understood that whoever occupied territory would control it after the war. He sent Eisenhower an urgent cable. The political aspects of where our forces are when the war ends cannot be ignored. Eisenhower, focused on ending the war, responded that post-war politics were not his concern. Soviet forces took Berlin. They occupied Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain descended. Within 2 years, Churchill was giving his famous Iron Curtain speech, warning about Soviet expansionism. Within weeks of victory, the same men who had stood together in photographs stopped speaking to each other. British and American generals who had fought side by side began writing memoirs that blamed their former allies for strategic failures. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany dissolved almost as quickly as it had been built. The official story of Allied unity in World War II is comforting. Democratic nations united by shared values, working together naturally to defeat fascist tyranny. The untold truth is more complicated and more instructive. Allied unity was never natural. It was built through crisis, maintained through imposed structure, and held together by the fact that failure would have meant annihilation for all parties. Britain needed American industrial power. America needed British experience and strategic position. Both needed the Soviet Union to absorb German military strength. The Soviet Union needed Western material support and the Second Front that eventually came. They cooperated not because they agreed, but because they needed each other. The generals who distrusted each other worked together because leaders like Eisenhower, Roosevelt, and Churchill forced them to subordinate personal and national pride to collective survival. The strategies that succeeded, unified command, imposed coordination, structured debate followed by committed execution, worked not because they were obvious, but because they were learned through painful failure and near catastrophic division. One American officer, reflecting years later, said something profound. "We didn't win because we liked each other. We won because we learned how to work together even though we didn't." This matters today because it reveals a truth about international cooperation that idealistic narratives obscure. Shared values aren't enough. Common threats aren't enough. Even obvious mutual interest isn't enough. Unity requires structure, leadership willing to impose difficult compromises, and the constant recognition that the alternative to cooperation is defeat. The Allied coalition won World War II, but it won despite natural divisions, not because those divisions didn't exist. Understanding that truth, that successful alliances are achievements built through constant effort, not natural states of being, might be the most important lesson the greatest generation left behind. If you want to understand why some alliances succeed and others fail, don't look at what they said in public. Look at how they survived disagreement in private. Next time, we'll examine how these painful lessons shaped NATO's creation and whether the structures that barely held together the World War II alliance can work when the existential threat is less obvious.